It's 1978, and a woman named Deborah Layton is standing in the sweltering heat of Guyana, watching 900 people line up to drink cyanide-laced Flavor Aid. Children first. She knows many of them by name. She's watched them laugh, pray, work the fields. Now she's watching them die. The most disturbing part? Most of them are smiling. They believe they're going to paradise. 6 months earlier, Deborah had escaped Jonestown, and her warnings were ignored. Now, as the bodies pile up in the jungle, one question burns through everything. How did faith override the most basic human instinct, the will to survive? This isn't a story about religion being good or bad. This is about something far more unsettling, something hardwired into the human brain that makes us capable of extraordinary acts of devotion and equally extraordinary acts of horror. It's about the psychology that turns reasonable people into true believers and truth into something negotiable. In 1961, a Yale psychologist named Stanley Milgram conducted what would become one of the most disturbing experiments in the history of psychology. He told participants they were helping with a study on learning and memory. Their job was simple: press a button to deliver electric shocks to a person in another room whenever they answered a question incorrectly. The shock started at 15 volts and increased incrementally up to 450 volts, clearly marked as danger, severe shock. Here's what most people don't know. There was no learner. The screams were recorded. The entire setup was theater. What Milgram was actually studying was obedience to authority, and the results were terrifying. 65% of participants, ordinary Americans from all walks of life, delivered shocks all the way to the maximum voltage. They heard screaming, they heard pounding on walls, they heard silence, and they kept pressing the button because a man in a lab coat told them it was necessary. Now, you might be thinking, I would never do that. That's exactly what the participants thought before they walked into that room. That's what Milgram's colleagues predicted, estimating that maybe 1% would go all the way. They were wrong by a factor of 65. And this tells us something crucial about the human mind. We are wired to submit to authority in ways that override our moral compass, our empathy, even our own perception of reality. But religious authority operates on a completely different level than a scientist in a lab coat. It claims to speak for the eternal, the infinite, the creator of everything. It doesn't just tell you what to do, it tells you what reality is. And here's where the psychology gets truly dark. The human brain has evolved to accept this. The default mode network in our brain, discovered in 2001 by neuroscientist Marcus Rachel, is most active when we're not focused on the external world, when we're daydreaming, reflecting, or thinking about others. Brain imaging studies show that when religious believers pray or meditate, their default mode network shows decreased activity in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for critical thinking and self-awareness. Meanwhile, activity increases in areas associated with reward, emotional regulation, and social bonding. In other words, religious experience literally feels good. It triggers the same reward circuits as drugs, sex, and social approval. This isn't accidental. Evolutionary psychologists argue that religion emerged because it provided survival advantages to early human groups. A tribe that believed their ancestors were watching them, that a god would punish betrayal, that suffering had cosmic meaning. These tribes stayed together. They cooperated. They sacrificed for each other. They outcompeted the groups that didn't have these binding beliefs. Religion, in this view, is cognitive glue. The problem is, glue doesn't care what it's sticking together. In 1954, a psychologist named Leon Festinger did something extraordinary. He infiltrated a UFO cult. The group, led by a woman named Dorothy Martin, believed that aliens called the Guardians would rescue them before a massive flood destroyed the world on December 21st. Festinger wanted to know what would happen when the prophecy failed, so he and his colleagues posed as believers and documented everything. December 21st came and went. No flood, no aliens, no rescue. Here's what you'd expect. The believers would realize they'd been wrong, feel embarrassed, and go home. That's not what happened. Instead, Dorothy Martin received a new message explaining that their faith had been so strong that God had spared the world. And the group's commitment intensified. They started proselytizing with renewed vigor, desperate to recruit others. Festinger had witnessed the birth of a concept that would revolutionize psychology: cognitive dissonance. When our beliefs clash with reality, our brains don't automatically side with reality. Instead, we experience psychological discomfort, dissonance, that our minds work desperately to resolve. And often the easiest solution isn't changing our belief, it's changing our perception of reality. This is why evidence rarely changes minds. The more invested you are in a belief, the more your identity is wrapped up in it, the more threatening contradictory evidence becomes. Your brain interprets it as an attack on your very self. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we dig into the hidden mechanisms that shape human behavior. If you're getting value from this deep dive into the psychology of belief, consider leaving us super thanks. It helps us continue creating content that asks the uncomfortable questions. And speaking of questions, drop a comment and let me know. Where in the world are you watching from, and what's your profession? I'm curious who's drawn to this kind of content. In 2009, neuroscientist Sam Harris conducted a study that would reveal something unsettling about how our brains process religious beliefs versus ordinary beliefs. He had participants evaluate statements while their brains were scanned using fMRI. Some statements were religious. God exists. Some were non-religious. The sun is a star. When evaluating non-religious statements, participants showed activity in brain regions associated with reasoning and evidence evaluation. But when evaluating religious beliefs, these regions went quiet. Instead, areas associated with emotion, reward, and self-representation lit up. The implications are staggering. Religious beliefs aren't processed like other beliefs, they're processed like facts about yourself. Challenging someone's religion isn't like correcting their math, it's like attacking their identity. This is why religious debates so rarely change anyone's mind. The brain is defending the self, not evaluating a proposition. But it gets darker. Once religious belief establishes itself as identity rather than hypothesis, it gains tremendous power over behavior. In 2007, psychologists conducted a study where they primed some participants with religious concepts like spirit, sacred, and prophet, while others saw neutral words. Then everyone played an economic game where they could cheat for profit. Those primed with religious concepts cheated significantly less even when they were non-believers. The mere activation of religious concepts triggered moral behavior. This sounds positive, right? Religion makes people behave better. But here's the twist. It only works for in-group members. Multiple studies have shown that religious priming increases cooperation and generosity toward members of your own religious group while decreasing it toward outsiders. Religious belief doesn't make you more moral in an absolute sense. It makes you tribally moral. And throughout history, this tribal morality has justified crusades, inquisitions, witch burnings, honor killings, and genocides, all committed by people who genuinely believed they were doing good. Consider the case of Andrea Yates. On June 20th, 2001, this Texas mother drowned her 5 children in a bathtub, one by one. The youngest was 6 months old. When asked why, she explained calmly that she was saving them. She believed she was a bad mother, that her children were developing incorrectly, and that if they grew up, they would go to hell. By killing them while they were still innocent, she was ensuring their salvation. She would go to hell in their place. In her mind, drowning her children was the ultimate act of maternal love. Andrea Yates had been diagnosed with severe postpartum psychosis, but her delusions were structured entirely by her religious worldview. She attended a church that preached a particularly harsh version of Christianity, emphasizing eternal damnation and maternal responsibility. Her illness didn't create these ideas, it activated and distorted beliefs that already existed in her cultural environment. The brain, even when malfunctioning, works with the material it's given. And when that material includes concepts of eternal torture and salvation through death, the results can be catastrophic. This raises an uncomfortable question. Where is the line between faith and delusion? In psychiatry, a delusion is defined as a fixed false belief that persists despite contradictory evidence. By this definition, many religious beliefs would qualify except for one crucial caveat. Beliefs are generally only considered delusional if they're not shared by your cultural group. If you believe God speaks to you and you live in a society where this is accepted, you're religious. If you believe it in a society where it's not accepted, you might be diagnosed with psychosis. The content of the belief matters less than its social context. In 1956, psychologist Solomon Asch conducted a deceptively simple experiment. He showed participants a line, then asked them to identify which of three other lines matched its length. The answer was obvious, but Asch had planted Confederates in the room who deliberately gave wrong answers. Alone participants made mistakes less than 1% of the time, but when surrounded by people confidently giving wrong answers, 75% of participants conformed at least once, choosing an answer they could clearly see was wrong. Think about that. People denied the evidence of their own eyes to conform to group consensus. Now imagine that same social pressure applied not to line lengths but to reality itself, to questions of origins, morality, death, and meaning. Religion doesn't just provide answers to these questions. It provides a community that reinforces those answers constantly. Prayer groups, sermons, scripture study, religious education, holidays, rituals, all of these create a social reality where certain beliefs are not just accepted but celebrated, while doubt is pathologized as a spiritual failing. This is why people born into religious families are overwhelmingly likely to adopt their parents' religion. It's not because they've evaluated all the world's religions and concluded theirs is correct. It's because humans are social learners. We acquire our reality from the people around us, especially in childhood when our brains are most plastic. By the time we develop the cognitive capacity for critical evaluation, the beliefs have already structured our neural networks, our identity, our social relationships. Changing them doesn't just require abandoning ideas, it requires rebuilding yourself and often losing your community. The power of this social reinforcement was demonstrated tragically in Waco, Texas in 1993. David Koresh, the leader of the Branch Davidians, convinced his followers of increasingly extreme beliefs, that he was the final prophet, that the apocalypse was imminent, that he had the right to take spiritual wives, including children. From the outside, these beliefs seem obviously delusional, but inside the compound, surrounded by believers, subjected to hours-long Bible study sessions, isolated from contradictory information, the beliefs became reality. When the FBI laid siege to the compound, 76 people, including 25 children, died in a fire. Most chose to stay inside. They believed they were living out prophesied events, that their suffering had cosmic significance. Here's what keeps me up at night. The psychological mechanisms that operated in Jonestown, in Waco, in every religious atrocity throughout history, these aren't unique to cults. They're the same mechanisms that operate in mainstream religion. The difference is one of degree, not kind. The belief that faith is virtuous, that doubt is dangerous, that certain texts contain ultimate truth, that moral authority comes from divine command, these ideas create a framework where reason becomes subordinate to revelation. And once you've accepted that framework, there's no logical stopping point. If God commands it, it must be good. If the text says it, it must be true. Even when God commands genocide. Even when the text contradicts observable reality. In 2011, researchers conducted a study that still makes my skin crawl. They presented religious believers with hypothetical scenarios where God commanded them to do terrible things. Abandon their family, commit murder, torture a child. Not ancient biblical scenarios, but modern ones. If God clearly told you to kill your child, would you do it? A disturbing percentage said yes. They struggled with the question, they didn't want to, but they concluded that if God truly commanded it, it must be morally right, even if they couldn't understand why. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac wasn't seen as a cautionary tale about dangerous obedience. It was held up as the ultimate example of faith. This is the dark heart of religious psychology, the elevation of obedience above moral reasoning. And it's not limited to extreme cases. Every time someone says God works in mysterious ways to explain suffering they can't justify, they're engaging in the same mental operation, suspending critical evaluation in favor of assumed divine wisdom. Every time someone accepts a moral rule because it's in their holy book rather than because they can articulate why it promotes human well-being, they're practicing obedience over ethics. The neuroscience backs this up. Studies of moral decision-making show that when people use secular ethical reasoning, they engage brain regions associated with complex problem-solving and empathy. But when they base moral decisions on religious commands, different regions activate, ones associated with rule-following and authority recognition. It's the difference between asking, "How does this affect people?" and asking, "What does the rulebook say?" One requires empathy and reason. The other requires submission. Now, some of you might be thinking, but religion has done so much good. Hospitals, charities, social justice movements. And you're absolutely right. Religion has motivated extraordinary altruism and social progress. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Every good thing done in religion's name could be done without it, and has been. You don't need to believe in God to build a hospital or fight for justice. But many of the harms, the burning of heretics, the oppression justified by Scripture, the cognitive frameworks that value faith over evidence, these are uniquely enabled by religious thinking. In 2006, psychologist Nicholas Epley conducted a fascinating study. He scanned people's brains while they thought about God's opinions and their own opinions on various issues. The result? The same brain regions activated for both. When people said, "God believes X," their brains showed the same patterns as when they said, "I believe X." But here's the kicker. When participants' opinions changed, so did their perception of God's opinions, and they didn't notice. God's beliefs tracked their own beliefs with eerie precision. People weren't discovering what God thought, they were projecting their own thoughts onto God and then claiming divine authority for them. This is the ultimate authority hack. You convince yourself that your opinions aren't just yours, they're endorsed by the creator of the universe. Suddenly, your personal preferences become cosmic imperatives. Your tribal prejudices become sacred truths. Your psychological needs become religious requirements. And because you've outsourced your beliefs to an invisible authority, they become unfalsifiable and immune to revision. You can't change your mind without betraying God. Think about the implications. If morality comes from God and you believe God is on your side, then anyone who disagrees with you is not just wrong, they're evil. They're not just mistaken, they're fighting against the ultimate good. This is why religious conflicts are so intractable. You can compromise with someone who has different interests. You can't compromise with someone who represents ultimate evil. You can negotiate with someone who has different opinions. You can't negotiate with someone who's defying the will of God. In 2019, a study examined the relationship between religious certainty and violence. The findings were chilling. The more certain people were that they possessed absolute truth, the more willing they were to support violence against those who threatened that truth. And religion uniquely provides absolute certainty. Science says, this is the best explanation given current evidence, subject to revision. Religion says, this is eternal truth revealed by God. One invites questioning, the other forbids it. But perhaps the darkest aspect of religious psychology is how it exploits our mortality. Ernest Becker, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book The Denial of Death, argued that much of human behavior is driven by terror of our own impermanence. We're the only species that knows it will die, and this knowledge is psychologically intolerable. So we create symbolic immortality projects, ways to feel that we transcend death. Art, children, nations, legacies, and religion offers the ultimate death denial. You don't really die. Your consciousness, your identity, your very self persists forever. This is extraordinarily powerful. Brain imaging studies show that when believers contemplate their own death, their fear response is significantly lower than non-believers. Religious belief literally reduces death anxiety. But there's a cost. To maintain this psychological comfort, you must maintain the belief. And once death denial is tied to belief, questioning that belief becomes existentially terrifying. It's not just changing your mind, it's confronting the full horror of mortality that you've been protecting yourself from. This is why deconversion is often described as traumatic. You're not just losing beliefs, you're losing your defense against existential terror. And religions know this. They use it. The promise of heaven, the threat of hell, the idea that this life is just a test, that real life begins after death. These concepts create a framework where earthly suffering becomes not just bearable but meaningful, even desirable. Martyrs throughout history have walked into death with smiles because they believed something better waited on the other side. This can inspire incredible courage, but it can also be weaponized. If you believe paradise awaits, what won't you do? What won't you endure? What won't you inflict? On September 11, 2001, 19 men flew planes into buildings, killing nearly 3,000 people in themselves. They weren't crazy in any clinical sense. They were educated, functional, normal by most measures, but they believed they were serving God. They believed they would be rewarded in paradise. They believed the people they killed were enemies of their faith. And those beliefs, instilled through years of religious indoctrination, overrode every natural human inhibition against mass murder and suicide. The uncomfortable question is this: what's the meaningful difference between their beliefs and more moderate religious beliefs? Both claim divine revelation. Both prioritize faith over evidence. Both divide the world into believers and non-believers. Both promise reward for obedience and punishment for defiance. The 9/11 hijackers were more extreme, certainly, but they were working with the same psychological and theological raw materials. They just took the premises to their logical conclusion. This is what I mean by the dark psychology of obedience to religion over truth. It's not that religious people are stupid or evil. It's that religious frameworks, by design, create cognitive structures that privilege belief over evidence, authority over reason, faith over doubt. And once those structures are in place, they can be used to justify almost anything. The human capacity for moral reasoning is hijacked and redirected. We become capable of celebrating our own critical thinking while simultaneously maintaining beliefs that would never survive it. In 2013, psychologist Will Gervais conducted a series of experiments on intuitive versus reflective thinking. He found that religious belief is strongly associated with intuitive thinking, going with your gut, while skepticism is associated with reflective thinking, overriding your intuition with analysis. When he primed people to think intuitively, religious belief increased. When he primed them to think analytically, it decreased. This suggests that religious belief is, in some sense, our default mode. It's what feels natural. Questioning it requires cognitive effort. This explains a lot. Throughout history, religion has been the norm and skepticism the exception. Not because religion is obviously true, but because it aligns with how our brains naturally operate. We're pattern-seeking, agent-detecting, storytelling creatures. We see faces in clouds and purpose in randomness. We assume minds behind events and meaning behind suffering. Religion codifies these cognitive tendencies into systems of belief. And because these beliefs feel intuitive, they feel true. Truth becomes conflated with what feels right, what our community affirms, what provides comfort. But here's the thing about truth: it doesn't care how you feel. The Earth orbited the sun long before we accepted it. Evolution occurred whether anyone believed it or not. Reality operates independently of our beliefs about it. And one of the most important developments in human history was the creation of methods for systematically overriding our intuitions to discover what's actually true. We call it science. It's not perfect, but it's self-correcting. It demands evidence. It celebrates changing your mind when new information emerges. It's the opposite of faith. And this is where the conflict lies. Not between religion and science as institutions, but between two fundamentally different approaches to knowledge. One says, accept what feels true. What authority declares, what your community believes, and defend it against doubt. The other says, accept only what evidence supports authority means nothing, and doubt everything, including your own certainty. These approaches can't be reconciled. One must be subordinate to the other, and throughout history, religion has demanded that faith take priority. Question too much and you're faithless. Doubt too much and you're sinful. Evidence that contradicts Scripture must be wrong. The Catholic Church's persecution of Galileo is the famous example, but it's hardly unique. Today, millions of people reject evolution, climate science, and medicine because they conflict with religious beliefs. They're not evaluating evidence and reaching different conclusions. They're rejecting evidence because it threatens their faith. And they're open about this. I believe in God's word over man's science isn't a fringe position, it's mainstream religious thinking. What makes this truly dark is that it's taught as virtue. Children are raised to view faith as noble and doubt as dangerous. They're told that questioning is the voice of Satan. That evidence is a test of faith. That feeling certain is more important than being correct. We're literally training the next generation to value belief over truth. And then we wonder why conspiracy theories spread, why misinformation flourishes, why people believe demonstrably false things. We've created a culture that celebrates belief without evidence in one domain, and then acts surprised when that habit of mind spreads to others. In 2016, researchers found that religious people were significantly more likely to believe conspiracy theories, not because of anything specific in religious doctrine, but because religious thinking and conspiracy thinking operate similarly. Both privilege secret knowledge over expert consensus. Both see patterns and agency where others see randomness. Both resist disconfirming evidence. Once you've learned to maintain belief despite evidence in one area, you've built a cognitive skill that can be applied anywhere. So where does this leave us? Is religion simply a psychological virus exploiting cognitive vulnerabilities to replicate itself at the expense of truth? That's too simplistic. Religion has been central to human civilization. It's created art, music, philosophy, social bonds. It's provided meaning to billions. The psychological mechanisms it exploits, pattern recognition, social conformity, authority deference, these exist for reasons. They helped our ancestors survive. The problem is that evolutionary adaptations for a prehistoric environment don't always serve us well in the modern world. Our intuitive physics works great for throwing spears but fails for understanding quantum mechanics. Our intuitive biology works fine for avoiding poisonous plants but fails for understanding evolution. And our intuitive psychology, which includes religious impulses, works fine for creating cohesive tribal groups, but fails often catastrophically when we need to understand reality accurately or cooperate across tribal lines. The question isn't whether religion feels true or provides comfort. The question is whether we should organize society, make decisions, and understand reality based on what feels true or on what actually is true. And increasingly, the stakes of getting this wrong are existential. Climate change, pandemics, nuclear weapons, artificial intelligence. These challenges require accurate understanding of reality and global cooperation. We can't afford to prioritize tribal beliefs over evidence. We can't afford to value faith over truth.